Jackson Hole, Wyoming. Over 4 million tourists visit it every year. They ski. They eat at restaurants that charge $40 for elk burgers. They take photos of the Tetons from the comfort of heated SUVs. And almost none of them know what the word hole actually means. It is not a canyon. It is not a geological feature you'd find in a textbook. It is a survival term, invented by fur trappers in the 1820s, and it described the one thing that kept entire brigades of men alive through Rocky Mountain winters that could drop to 40 below zero. A hole was a valley, ringed by mountains, with enough game and water and shelter to keep you breathing until spring. Then, on a November morning in 1836, the streams froze solid across the Yellowstone drainage, and a brigade of trappers led by Jim Bridger had to make a choice that every mountain man dreaded: stop trapping, find a hole, or die out in the open. If you'd asked anyone in Street Note, Louis, about these men back in 1822, they would have told you they were either very brave or very stupid. Probably both. That year, a fur company placed an ad in a Missouri newspaper calling for 100 enterprising young men to ascend the Missouri River and spend years trapping beaver in territory that most Americans could not find on a map. The pay was decent if you survived. Beaver pelts brought $4 to $6 per pound at market, and a resourceful trapper could haul in 400 to 500 pounds per season. At the peak of the trade, that added up to roughly $2,000 a year. Serious money in the 1820s. But the work had a hard seasonal stop. Beaver fur reaches its thickest and most valuable density during the coldest months, when the animal's coat grows lush against the freeze. And that is exactly when the beaver becomes impossible to catch. The ponds turn to ice. The rivers lock up. The streams where trappers set their steel traps become slabs of frozen water that no man can wade into without risking death from hypothermia. The very thing these men had come to harvest became unreachable at the exact moment it was worth the most. That left months of cold with nothing productive to do and nowhere safe to go. The men who had signed up to trap beaver suddenly had a very different job on their hands: staying alive. The fur brigades that wintered in the mountains chose their campsites with the kind of precision you would expect from a military operation. They were looking for very specific things: plentiful game. Because a brigade of 30 or 40 men needed to eat for 4 or 5 months straight. Firewood within easy hauling distance. Because a single night without fire at altitude could kill a healthy man. Clean running water that would not freeze completely, which usually meant springs or fast-moving creeks. And fodder for the horses and mules, because if the livestock starved, there was no way to move pelts or supplies when spring finally broke. What comes next is the part that still doesn't match the popular image of the frontier as a place of log cabins and homesteads. These men almost never built log cabins. In many cases, they simply could not. Timber was often scarce at the elevations and locations where they needed to camp. Even when trees were available, building a proper cabin required saws, axes, nails, and manpower that a small trapping party moving through unfamiliar territory did not have. They were not settlers. They were not putting down roots. They were surviving until the ice melted so they could get back to work, so they improvised. Some dug straight into the earth. Trappers carved shelters into riverbanks, scooping out rooms just large enough for 2 or 3 men to sleep in, with low ceilings that held body heat and entrances angled downward to keep wind from blowing directly inside. The Forest History Society's records describe the standard approach. Trappers built a log cabin or a dugout in a bank and would live off the land, except for essentials like salt and flour. These dugouts were simple, ugly, and remarkably effective. The ground itself became insulation. 2 feet of packed earth above your head holds warmth far better than any canvas tent, and the temperature inside a well-built dugout could sit around 35 or 40 degrees, even when the outside air was well below zero. You were not comfortable, but you were alive. Others built what the old journals call a Shantee. Rufus Sage, a writer and traveler who spent time in the Rockies around 1842, described seeing a hunter's winter camp up close. The camp was set up in a spot screened by hills and rocks, chosen to catch the full warmth of the sun during the day while staying hidden from any roaming parties of hostile warriors that might pass through. A grove of dry timber stood nearby for fuel, and a creek ran close enough that the men could hear it from inside their shelters. The shanty itself faced a massive fire and was made from animal skins carefully stretched over an arched framework of slender poles, bent into a semicircle. It was open on the fire-facing side so the heat could radiate inward, and the skins on the curved back wall cut the wind. A man could sit inside one of these, wrapped in buffalo robes, watching a fire burn 3 feet in front of him, and feel something close to warm. The design was elegant in its simplicity. No nails, no lumber, just poles, hides, and the knowledge of which direction to face the opening so smoke and wind cooperated instead of fighting each other. And then there was the teepee. Mountain men who had formed relationships with native communities could sometimes purchase or trade for a used lodge. Bonneville's expedition made a point of acquiring lodges from the Shoshone specifically for this purpose. A well-made teepee was superior to anything a trapper could build in a hurry. The conical shape shed wind and snow naturally. The smoke flap at the top could be adjusted to control airflow, and the interior, lined with furs and warmed by a central fire, could house a family or a small group of men through the worst weather the mountains could produce. But teepees were not always available, and they were not cheap. A trapper who could not get one was back to the dugout, the Shantee, or the open sky. Warren Ferris, working for the Hudson's Bay Company during the winter of 1834-35, described setting up his brigade's winter quarters in a large grove of aspen trees at the edge of an excellent spring. The spring gave them clean water all winter. The aspen grove gave them timber and windbreak, and the surrounding country gave them access to enough game to survive until the thaw. Ferris made it sound almost rational, almost planned, but choosing a camp was always a gamble. You were betting your life that the game would hold. The weather would stay within human tolerances, and nobody would come looking for a fight between November and March. The food situation in winter camp deserves its own reckoning. These men ate almost nothing but meat for months at a stretch. Buffalo, elk, deer, and whatever smaller game they could find. When fresh meat was available, they ate well. When storms kept the hunters pinned down or the herds moved away, the camp went hungry. There were no supply trains in winter. No backup provisions coming from St. Louis. Whatever you had when the snow set in was all you were going to get until spring. Some trappers supplemented their diet with roots and berries they had learned to identify from native women, but many did not bother, and the all-meat diet took a toll. Scurvy and other nutritional illnesses were common by late winter, when the body's reserves ran out and the landscape offered nothing green. And the timing of what happened next was almost too perfect. The same men who could not trap beaver in winter discovered that the cruelest months produced the pelts worth the most money. Fall and spring trapping yielded decent skins, but the thick, luxurious winter coats that European hatmakers paid top dollar for only developed during the coldest weeks of the year. The animals these men needed were right under the ice, growing the most valuable fur of the season, and the men were powerless to reach them. Winter was not just a danger, it was a taunt. So they waited. And while they waited, they found ways to keep themselves and their animals alive that borrowed heavily from the people who had been surviving these winters for thousands of years before any European set foot in the Rockies. Native peoples across the northern mountains taught trappers skills that most of them would never have worked out alone. How to build shelters that could hold heat through a blizzard. How to find edible roots and berries underneath snow. How to read subtle weather signs that warned of approaching storms hours before they hit. The Shoshone, the Crow, the Nez Perce, and the Flathead all had generations of accumulated knowledge about surviving in this landscape, and they shared it through trade, through marriage between trappers and native women, and sometimes just through the simple proximity of shared winter camps. Captain Benjamin Bonneville, leading a fur company expedition in the early 1830s, camped near Shoshone bands specifically to purchase lodges, furs, and what he called articles of winter comfort. He was not being romantic about it. He understood that these people had solved problems his men could not. One of the most critical pieces of borrowed knowledge involved keeping the horses alive. A fur brigade might rely on dozens of horses and mules, and losing them meant losing the entire spring operation. Buffalo herds had often destroyed the grass across wide stretches of the high country, leaving nothing for livestock to graze on during the frozen months. The solution, learned from native horsemen, was cottonwood bark. Trappers would strip the bark from sweet cottonwood trees lining the river bottoms and feed it to their animals every night. Osborne Russell, journaling during the winter of 1836-37 with Jim Bridger's brigade on the Yellowstone, noted that the horses and mules were very fond of the bark, and it sustained them through the season. But here's the detail that everyone missed. This trick only worked if you had chosen your winter hole carefully. No cottonwood groves meant no bark. No bark meant your horses starved. Dead horses meant no way to move your pelts come spring. The entire commercial engine of the Rocky Mountain fur trade depended, during the most vulnerable months of the year, on whether your campsite had the right kind of trees growing nearby. The business rose and fell on cottonwood. If you're finding this interesting, consider subscribing. I cover forgotten corners of history like this every week. While all of this was unfolding at the brigade level, with organized camps and assigned roles and at least some semblance of planning, individual trappers and small parties were fighting their own private wars with winter. Some of those stories survived only because the men involved happened to write them down later, and reading those accounts, you start to wonder how anyone made it through this era at all. James Clyman was one of the first mountain men to head west. He signed on with the Rocky Mountain Fur Company in 1823 and found himself, a few months later, in the Wind River Valley of present-day Wyoming, wintering alongside a band of Crow people. He and his companion, William Sublette, were forced to leave the village to hunt meat because the camp was running low on food. The late winter months were always the hardest. Stored provisions ran out, game got scarce, and somebody had to go. A blizzard caught them in the open. Wind, snow, and cold were all working against them as they struggled to stay alive. They killed a buffalo for shelter and food, but they needed fire. Their hands were so numb from the cold that they could not grip the flint and steel. Clyman tried striking sparks. Nothing caught. Sublette tried. Same result. Their flintlock rifles would not fire either. The steel was too cold, their fingers too stiff, and the tinder too wet. Both men were moving toward the kind of cold where your body simply shuts down and you stop shivering, which is the last thing that happens before you die. Then Clyman found something in the ashes of a previous campfire. A single coal, still barely holding heat. He nursed it with dried sagebrush until it caught. The two men pressed against that fire through the night, feeding it scraps and shielding it from the wind. Without that one ember in a pile of cold ash, both of them would have frozen to death on the Wyoming plain. Sublette went on to become a partner in the fur company. Clyman went on to guide emigrant trains clear across the continent. The entire trajectory of both men's lives pivoted on whether a coal from some stranger's old fire had gone completely cold or not. That is how thin the margin was in winter. The word hole itself tells you how these men saw the landscape around them. To an early trapper, a hole was a sizable valley surrounded by mountains, rich in game, and usually named after whoever had first claimed it or died there. Jackson's Hole was named in 1829 for David Jackson, a partner in the Rocky Mountain Fur Company, who spent the winter on the shores of Jackson Lake because the valley had everything a wintering brigade needed. Pierre's Hole was named for Le Grand Pierre Tivanatagan, a Hudson's Bay Company trader of Iroquois descent, who was killed in a battle with Blackfoot warriors in 1827. Brown's Hole, tucked along the Green River in what is now Colorado, earned its reputation as the mildest wintering ground in the northern Rockies, a place where the game never seemed to run thin and the cold never quite reached the killing threshold. Each of these holes was chosen for the same reasons: shelter from wind, access to water, timber for fire, game for food, cottonwood for horses. A hole was not just a nice valley with a pretty view. It was a survival calculation, and getting it wrong could cost an entire brigade everything they had. For a while, things actually seemed manageable inside these winter camps. The trapping stopped, but a kind of community took its place. Joe Meek, one of the more colorful mountain men of the era, called the winter months a season of busy idleness. The men read books, some of them borrowed from a small library maintained at Fort Hall, a Hudson's Bay Company trading post in present-day Idaho. They hunted for recreation as much as for food. They sharpened and repaired traps, mended clothing made from hides, told stories that got taller with every retelling, debated politics, and occasionally tried to teach each other something useful. Russell described the Brigades' winter lodges as snug, with fires burning in the center, buffalo robes piled deep, and enough routine to keep men from going mad with boredom. On cold nights, the men shared robes and blankets for body heat, sleeping pressed together in a practice that was simply common sense at the time. Rudolf Kurz, a Swiss artist traveling with fur traders, described how men would spread buffalo skin pads on the open prairie, pile robes on top, and call their dogs to lie across them for additional warmth and to serve as guards. This was not a last resort. This was the standard approach. But trouble had a way of finding even the best-planned winter camp. During the winter of 1836 to 37, Bridger's brigade discovered that they had set up camp uncomfortably close to a large Blackfoot village. Skirmishes broke out in February when small Blackfoot war parties probed the trappers' position. The brigade barely avoided a full-scale confrontation with a much larger force. The fact that fighting happened at all in February was unusual. Winter was traditionally a time of truce across the northern Rockies, when everyone focused on survival rather than conflict. The two groups had simply chosen the same hole, the same valley, for the same survival reasons. And neither knew the other was there until it was too late to move. You'd think someone would have said something about that risk before they settled in. Nobody did. And this points to something larger about the fur trade's relationship with winter that rarely gets discussed. The annual summer rendezvous, those famous gatherings where hundreds of trappers met supply caravans to trade pelts and resupply, were not just commercial events. They were the last chance to prepare for the coming cold. The rendezvous tradition started in 1825 under General William Ashley, and for 16 years, these gatherings took place in valleys across Wyoming, Idaho, and Utah. Men bought ammunition, traps, blankets, knives, coffee, tobacco, and alcohol at prices marked up several times over what they cost in St. Louis. A trapper could spend an entire season's earnings in a week of trading and celebration. One historian described Rendezvous as one hell of a party. Horse races, shooting contests, gambling, drinking. The camaraderie of men who spent most of the year in small, isolated groups, finally getting to see faces other than their own. But when the party ended, usually by August, the men scattered back into the mountains in small brigades, and they had roughly 2 months of fall trapping before winter shut everything down. Whatever supplies they had purchased at Rendezvous, plus whatever they could hunt and forage, had to last until the following summer. There was no resupply chain. There was no second chance. When November came and the ice sealed the streams, you were on your own with whatever you had packed. Charles Larpenteur, another trapper who left behind written records, described getting caught in a January storm in 1840. The blizzard was so dense that his party could not see in any direction. Their guide, a native man whose name Larpenteur did not record, led them to a small cluster of scrubby elm trees. But the snow had drifted so deep around the trees that they could not reach dry wood. No fire that night. Their solution was to dig holes in the snow and crawl inside. The snow itself became the walls and ceiling. A properly constructed snow shelter can maintain a temperature around 32 degrees inside, even when the air outside drops to 40 below zero. Your body heat does the work. The snow traps dead air, and dead air insulates, but you have to know how to dig one before your hands freeze. And you have to know that the sleeping platform needs to sit higher than the entrance because warm air rises and you want to sleep in the warmest pocket. This was not guesswork. It was engineering, learned from people who had been building these shelters since long before any European arrived in North America. Alexander Ross learned the limits of winter travel in a more dramatic fashion. He was leading a Hudson's Bay Company party of 140 people, some of them family members of the trappers, along with a group of hired Iroquois, through the mountains near present-day Montana. His expedition took him up the Bitterroot River, through the Bitterroot Valley, and into what Ross himself called the Valley of Troubles. The snow was deep, temperatures were near zero, and passage east over the densely forested hills into the Big Hole Valley looked close to impossible. For several days, Ross waited for orders to turn back. None came. His men began threatening to desert, and the threats edged toward outright mutiny. Ross, who had spent enough winters in the mountains to know that a man alone in these conditions was a dead man, gave the deserters a simple ultimatum. Anyone caught leaving would have their clothing confiscated. Every shirt, every coat, every pair of moccasins. The prospect of standing naked in 10-foot snowdrifts in the northern Rockies changed every mutinous mind on the spot. They pushed through the pass and survived. But the fact that Ross had to threaten his own men with forced nudity in a frozen mountain range tells you everything about how desperate the winter months could make people. When spring finally came, the survivors of these winter camps did not celebrate. They got back to work. The ice broke up on the rivers and streams, and the men waded back in, knee-deep and waist-deep in snowmelt that was barely above freezing, to set their traps and collect the beaver pelts that had grown thick and valuable through the cold months. The transition from winter survival to spring trapping was not a relief. It was a different kind of suffering. Your camp was behind you, but the icy water ahead of you could cripple a man with rheumatism or frostbite in a season or two. The lowest-ranking men in the trade lasted an average of 2.7 years. Many of them did not leave voluntarily. Their bodies gave out. The fur trade reached its commercial peak somewhere between 1830 and 1832. Between 500 and 600 trappers were working the streams and valleys of the northern Rockies during those years. But the industry was already consuming itself. Trappers were so efficient that they stripped entire watersheds clean of beaver, forcing them to push deeper into more remote and more dangerous territory each year. Longer supply lines, more exposure to hostile ground, more brutal winters in country no white trapper had ever spent a cold season in before. And then the economics collapsed. The European hat market pivoted from beaver felt to silk, and the price of pelts dropped from $6 a pound to barely $1 or $2. By 1840, the annual Rendezvous, the great summer gathering where trappers had once traded pelts for supplies and celebrated with what one historian called one hell of a party, held its last meeting. Fewer than 75 trappers were still working the Rockies, down from 500 or more just a decade earlier. The average career at the lowest level of the trade lasted 2.7 years. Clerks and traders managed 6.3. The men at the top, with better conditions and bigger financial stakes, lasted 15 years on average. But the trade itself was done. The valleys kept their names long after the last brigade packed up. Jackson Hole, Pierre's Hole, Brown's Hole, Gardner's Hole. The word hole traveled from the mouths of freezing trappers into government maps, then into tourism brochures, and finally into the names of ski resorts and luxury real estate developments. Tourists who fly into Jackson Hole Airport, the only commercial airport located entirely within a national park, walk off their planes into a town where a modest house costs over $2 million. They do not hear the desperation in that name. They do not picture men stripping cottonwood bark at dusk to keep horses alive, or a trapper digging into a frozen riverbank with his bare hands because his canvas tent will not survive a night at 30 below. The mountains have not changed. The wind still comes down the Teton Range the same way it did in 1829 when David Jackson chose that valley because it could keep his men alive until spring. The same creeks freeze and thaw on the same schedule. And every winter, these valleys fill with the same heavy snow that once buried the camps of men who had no word for what they were doing except holing up and waiting it out. What survived from that era is not the shelters or the camps or the men who built them. It is the name they gave to the thing that saved them, carved into the landscape of the American West, outlasting everything else about the trade that created it. If you want to see the story of another forgotten survival strategy that shaped the frontier, that video is on screen now.